My name is Malcolm Pittock. I was born on the 19th of March 1930, which means that I shall be 92 next birthday, which is only a few weeks away. My grandfather was one of the founders before the First World War of the Luton Labour Party. He was friendly with Keir Hardie, and Keir Hardie used to come and stay. And when my grandmother had to leave her house and live with one of her daughters as she was getting too frail, she looked round the house and she said, if these walls could speak. She was thinking actually of the conversations, I think, between Keir Hardie and my grandfather. He was in an anomalous and interesting position, which is always I think it was maybe unique. He was technically an employer. He was in partnership with his brother, and they had a small but very prosperous engineering firm in Luton. His brother ran the financial side, and he was responsible for the actual making of things. He was an inventor. His firm manufactured machinery for the straw hat change, which was the principal trade of Luton in those days, before the First World War. My mother was very fond of her father, and she became, a convinced socialist. She was brought up, and I say she was she was a clever woman, and she got a scholarship to the local grammar school. And before the First World War, they were very rare indeed. And just to give you an idea of the spirit that she'd inherited, she was at the school when Edward VIII died. And Edward VII was known as having a fancy lady in a village or small town close by. And the girls in the school were instructed to wear black ribbons in their hair when he died. When my mother went home, she said, I've been told that we must wear black ribbons in our hair for Edward VIII. He said, you're not wearing a black ribbon in your hair for that old reprobate. And so she went to school. She went to school without the black ribbon in her hair. And the headmaster picked her. I said, what are you doing without a black ribbon? My father says, I'm not to wear a black ribbon for that old reprobate. Well, there's nothing they could do about that. So that shows the degree to which she inherited my grandfather's spirit. The second influence of me, and I was just talking about it when you were coming in, was my Uncle Alfred. He wasn't an uncle by blood, he was an uncle by marriage. He married my mother's sister, my Aunt Louie. And he was remarkable because he came from a working class background. His father was a coach painter, and he was trained as a piano tuner, and he was 21 when conscription was brought in. So immediately finished his training, he was liable to go in the army, because that was it. And he became, well, he became a conscientious objector, and he was one of a group of conscientious objectors which are known, as the Frenchmen. And they were taken to France. The idea was that they would crack, they would be subject to persecution because of this pretense. They were given military orders which they were, which they refused. And I think it's true to say that they all refused. They didn't crack anybody. They were sentenced to be shot by Field Marshal Haig. But at the very last minute, the Prime Minister of the day, the one before Lloyd George, overruled Haig. But nonetheless, Haig went through it as a charade, he set it up as if they were going to be shot, and then said, sentenced to be shot, yes, mitigated to 10 years penal servitude. We milked it for all he was allowed to milk it. He couldn't do what he wanted to do. That's right. One incident which I wrote about in the letter to The Guardian when about 2014. It's interesting. Not long before he was supposed to be executed, he was called in by a military officer who said to him, Evans, I've seen your papers and they're marked death. Do you really want to go through with this? So he said, yes, men are dying in the trenches for what they believe in, and I wouldn't be less than they. At which point, the officer stepped back and saluted him. I've never met anything like that in the literature of the First World War. So he stayed. He was sent to prison for, I think it was about 1919 before he was released. And he actually did join an alternative scheme at Dice. They were offered, those in prison who'd been, the Frenchmen were offered the alternative at Dice, to Dice. They found actually that it was being involved with the military, so objected to it. But why he was put in prison again and taken up one of these schemes was, again, these sort of quirks that related to my family. I think he was working in Wales on such a scheme. And I think they were paid normal rates, and he found they weren't observing union rates or conditions. So he tried to get the Central Board of Conscientious Objectors interested in this, and Bertrand Russell was on the Board of Conscientious Objectors, and he seemed the only one that appreciated it, as a matter of fact, because my uncle wrote to him about it, and long after the war he mentioned it, or wrote, I don't know how it happened, he mentioned it to Russell, and Russell remembered it, yes. So he was in prison for the rest of the war, and beyond that. So it was an very strong anti-war attitude coming from my mother. My father was in the First World War right through, and he lost his brother. He was killed in the last month or two of the war. He was very fond of his brother and regarded him, he looked up to him. And that meant that although he supported the Second World War, I don't say it in them, I can never remember my father wearing a red poppet. I can never remember him going to any remembrance parades. So, because he never forgave the war for the death of his brother, and it had a great influence on his life. Then, of course, my mother was always anti-war. She was in the PPU, the Peace Pledge Union, before the Second World War, and she never supported the Second World War. And of course, I was sent to a Quaker school when I was 13, and of course I was sent to an organisation which didn't support the war either. Indeed, I remember that when I went, the previous headmaster had died, and an interim, who was a senior master, was in charge until they appointed a permanently. Now the senior master who was in charge allowed poppers to be sold in the school, and there were 11th. The new headmaster wouldn't allow it. I mean, it shows the influence you get from the Quakers. In the war, the headmaster wouldn't allow red poppers to be sold. I registered, I was at university, and I registered when I was 18 in 1948. But after my degree, I stayed on to do research, and I got deferment till I was in my mid-20s. I'd registered at 18, but you raised it as a conscientious objector. When the prospect of actually being called up came up, I started by thinking that I would accept a condition, because it's quite easy to get a condition. And when I went as a conscientious objector, I was given a condition that I accepted as a conscientious objector so long as I did my 2 years in forestry. I appealed against that, and if I worked in the hospital or forestry, that would do. Meanwhile, I had come to the view that you had to be a conscientious objector. I objected, in other words, some conscientious objectors conscientious objectors because they mightn't have, though they usually had, any fundamental objection to war, but they felt they couldn't fight in it, you know. I, as a conscientious objector, because I am an unconditional one, because I was against war. I didn't think anybody should be called up to fight, yes. So my mother was puzzled, I remember, by my absolutism. But she immediately understood it when the chap Louis' next door to us called Mr. Dawson. I said, if I was required to shoot Mr. Dawson, I wouldn't just say no, but I certainly wouldn't say, but I'll do something else instead, because that accepts the obligation. I was arrested. No, I was given a date to appear at the magistrate's court. I didn't appear. That was part of the objection, and so I had to be arrested. I was given 6 months, and I remember waiting in the police station, Tomberton, where I lived, to be taken to Strangeways. So I was taken to Strangeways. Now, I was transferred almost immediately to an open prison in Rochdale. It was a building, originally an orphanage, which was being rehabilitated, yes. So I worked with the carpenter, not did very much. But I'll never remember, most prison governors at that time were retired military men. But Gilbert Hare, who was the governor of Strangeways, wasn't. I know, and he had no side with dealing with me. He wouldn't object. He'd known I'd spent 4 years in a Quaker boarding school, Ackworth, near Pontefract. And I remember him saying to me, because he was around when I was transferred, he said, "You've been to boarding school, you won't find this much different." When I was at Ackworth, we had wooden beds without springs, but with slats. But in Buckley Hall, we had proper stone beds. At Ackworth, strange to say, you had an occasional fire in the dormitory, but really there was no central heating, even in the terrible winter of 1947. So it was quite right. And actually, the warders took it in turns to run Buckley Hall, and I remember I was allowed to give a sort of presentation of my conscientious position to the rest of them. I must say that most people wouldn't say this at all. I was glad I went to prison. I met people in prison that I wouldn't normally have met. You know, there's only 1 or 2 took against me, so got on reasonably well with the other prisoners. I've never. When I went to in Strangeways, I was in a cell with 2 other prisoners, because they were overcrowded in those days. you know, interesting children, yes. One of this was a middle-aged paedophile. Yeah. Yeah. I became involved continuously in campaigning at the time of the foundation of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, right? Because I lived in Crewe at the time, and I founded, I don't think it exists any longer, I founded the Crewe campaign for nuclear disarmament. Yes. Again, I belonged, if you like, to the left of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. There was a split in those days, not now, a split's been broken down, between those who believed, like Canon Collins, who more or less founded it, that you should never break the law. So, but there was a group, the Direct Action Committee Against Nuclear War, which arranged sit-down demonstrations, which I was involved in one in December 1958. Sit-down demonstrations they were building a base at Swaffham. We were given back, it had to go down to the magistrates' court a week later. I was always ashamed of myself because I agreed to be bound over. My mother, who was very frail, depended on me, but I couldn't possibly leave her. Mind you, if I hadn't allowed myself to be bound over, I'd have probably nipped my career in the bud. So, because I was a WA tutor organiser at the time, and I wouldn't have been able to continue with my job. So it was pretty consistent from then on. I was invited to join the Committee of 100. That was founded by Bertrand Russell and Michael Scott, who was very prominent as a campaigner against apartheid. Probably forgotten now. The idea of the Committee of 100 was to organise sit-down demonstrations. Since Bertrand Russell, who was one of the founders, it got considerable publicity. And I took part in the sit-down demonstration in Trafalgar Square in I think it was 9th September 1961. It's historic because quite a lot of celebrities took part in that. Yes, all sorts of people. People sometimes will completely turn around later. I remember a chap called Adam Roberts. Adam Roberts was in fact roughed up by the police and wrote about it in the New Statesman. He later became, for a time, the editor of Peace News, was a periodical which I took, and he ended up as Professor of International Affairs at Oxford, Cambridge, and he completely changed his tune. He even justified, because I kept in touch with him, he even justified the attack Oh, you're right. You see people change completely, yes. I was one of those that gets more radical as I grow older, rather than less, which was in fact rather like Bertrand Russell. If he is a complete radical, yes. I used to write lots of letters to the paper. I've always been writing letters to the paper. I say this isn't directly to do with me, but it shows something, I think, which would interest you. I saw a letter in the Crew Chronicle from a chap who was in the army called Derek Tatton, supporting the position of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. So I thought, I'll go around and see this chap. I didn't know he was in the army at this time. I went around and see the chap, and his mother opened the door and told me he was in the army. So Derek came to my WA classes, and I did courses involving war and indeed the 19th century industrial law. And he was one of the best campaigners for Crew campaign for nuclear disarmament. I think he'd been discharged from the army on compassionate grounds because of his mother. His father died just after I came to see her, I remember. Now, he had been to a secondary modern school. And one of the secondary modern schools started to take public examination. Indeed, they had a specially adapted one, didn't they? Certificate of secondary education. And although he got a decent job, he was a sort of railway clerk, he wanted to have a better education. In those days, not now, they had adult education colleges which prepared you for university entrance. The one he had, which was actually nearest us, I think, was Coleg Harlech in Wales. They no longer do that, by the way. And Derek he asked me to recommend him, and of course I did. All right, he got into Coleg Harlech. In those days, they got a grant. You know, the days when they used to get grants for going to university, long gone, and like places like Coleg Harlech. Then he found, I think it was when he had got his advanced GCSEs, he stayed there 2 years, that there was a scholarship open for Oxford or Cambridge. And it was, you got it not by sitting an examination, but by writing a dissertation. Derek did that, and he was accepted as an undergraduate at Cambridge. I don't know whether you know, I'm sure you may have heard of Raymond Williams. Culture and Society, The Long Revolution. One of the reasons why he wanted to go to Cambridge was that Raymond Williams was there, I think. Because I'd introduced him to the work of Raymond Williams through the WEA. He wasn't at Raymond Williams's college, but in his third year, he asked Raymond, we got to know, whether he would be his tutor for the final year. And he agreed. Derek knew, as I knew, that one of the reasons why Raymond Williams was so favourable to him was that Raymond Williams' father had been a signalman on the railway, and Derek's father had also been on the railway. And Derek went right through and he got his PhD. He asked Raymond Williams if he would supervise it, though Williams wasn't delegated to do that. And he got it not with Cambridge, but the Open University, and Williams did that. And later, after Williams's death, Derek worked in adult education, became warden of the adult education in college in Stoke, or near Stoke, I should say. And he founded the Raymond Williams Foundation, which organised weekend schools for adults. I won't go on with it. It's really because he became acquainted with me through the DND that all this happened. And it's unique, it's not a completely unique trajectory, but I've never met anyone. You don't usually get from secondary one school to Cambridge. But he did. Anyway, I still keep in touch with him. We're still friendly. Of course, he's retired long ago. Well, I was also a WA tutor organiser for crew, which caused a lot of grief to people, I can show you. Because it was in those days when they were obsessed with invasion. I never believed it, never. It reminds me of the time before the attack on Iraq, when there was a protest meeting. But it was run rather strange. It seemed to be run by a sort of semi-professional chairman rather than a committed one, yes. And I remember him saying, hands up those who believe that Saddam Hussein has nuclear weapons. Who don't believe it, but put up their hands. This is important, I think, because you must never trust experts. I mean, if it's a technical matter, that's different. But if it's a matter of opinion, the idea, I mean, look at the people who actually believed that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. Huh. I'm naturally a radical, I think, because and of course I was very, when I came to Bolton, I became very, very much involved. When I was at Aberdeen, I was at the time chairman for peace in Vietnam. I was very strongly opposed to the war in Vietnam. And of course, very strongly opposed to the sanctions on Iraq. Very strongly opposed to the war, right? Very strongly opposed to the war on Yugoslavia. Oh, absolutely. The war, I'm against it. And besides all the actual physical campaigning I did, I wrote a lot of letters to the paper. Now, the only thing I can do is just to write letters to the paper. And I found, I don't know how it happened. I don't know how it happened. It wasn't true of the local paper, but then the number of people that write to the local paper is limited more or less to Bolton. I found somehow some kind of censorship was going on, particularly with the big papers. I got involved with the accusations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which I thought were false. And involved a deliberate attempt to smear the character of, sorry, what's his name? Jeremy Corbyn. It's frightful. I also found that if I wrote to a national paper defending Jeremy Corbyn, it wouldn't be printed. Oh, absolutely no doubt about that. If Corbyn had been elected, there would have been all this business of breaking promises and throwing parties and telling lies or near lies in Parliament. Because Corbyn, and this is what's so, he never got any credit for it. He never attacked people personally. He always argued against the point, not the person. It didn't do him any good. I thought, well, indeed, and I recommend it too, because I've been in conversation, correspondence with him. He should have sued Margaret Hodge for libel. The idea of placing a wreath of white poppies on the centre was Bertie's idea. It didn't come from the campaign for Unity Solomon. It was his own idea. Bertie he was a communist. It's remarkable how an outcast, you know. The point was, it was always in his favour with the general public. He was in the war himself, he was in Bomber Command. So he did actually, I mean, he was in the most dangerous, probably the most dangerous of these, because a lot of his colleagues, or we could call them colleagues, were killed. So that was always in favour with the general public. And also, when he first started doing it, he was in the Farnworth branch of the British Legion. and they ejected him from the club. So Bertie being Bertie, because he was a fighter with Bertie, there's no doubt about that, he wrote the headquarters of the British Legion, telling what had happened, and they insisted with Falmouth that he was reinstated. They weren't allowed to reject. So that was it. And of course, not only did Bertie, he participated in a lot of the London demonstrations. And as you know, Bertie for quite a number of years, towards the end of his life, and more or less until he died, used to go out on Saturdays for an hour or so and hold up a placard making a peace point. And getting in conversation, because he got in conversation, people told him, and of course, when he died, so quite a number of people came to his funeral. Bolton had become, in the 60s, I think, a nuclear-free zone. I chased it up with the council. They never rescinded it. It still is a nuclear-free zone. And we decided in C&D whether we could sort of get it going again. Oh, it was just 20 years ago, I think. We couldn't. See if we could get some kind of memorial to Bertie. Well, we did, as you know. And it was a ceremonial opening which the mayor addressed. And it was a rainy day, so we didn't get quite as many as we had, but it was successful, and it's still there. Yeah. Well, to tell you the truth, none of it. None of it. I mean, we still have nuclear weapons, and indeed, the hold of nuclear weapons has increased on us. It's like, that's all so terrible. As you know, a year ago, just a year and 1 month ago, a treaty banning nuclear weapons was drawn up by the United Nations General Assembly. The whole idea was for nations there had been similar ones, like about landmines, treaty against landmines. You couldn't impose it on people, they had to sort of sign up to it. When it was being drawn up, none of the nuclear powers would have anything to do with it. Now it's international law, it's the same. Shocking, absolutely shocking. I remember the broadcast where there was a bulletin about the bombing of Hiroshima. I remember August the 6th, 1945. I was shocked then, and I'm still shocked.